Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Creation Myths. Today, we are going to look at some of the fallout from my recent debate with Dr. Jerry Bergman, young Earth creationist Dr. Jerry Bergman, and specifically today, we are going to look at how, yes, lizards have in fact evolved placentas. The backstory here is that on January 18th, 2025, I debated young Earth creationist Dr. Jerry Bergman on the topic of common descent versus common design. I've linked that full debate down below in the description so you can watch the whole thing if you feel like doing so. I think you should watch it. I think it was fun. I had a good time. Watch the debate. During the question and answer session towards the end of the debate, a viewer asked for examples of macroevolution, and I provided several examples, and one of the examples I gave as what I think is a really notable example of directly documented large-scale evolutionary change is the appearance of placentas in various species of lizards. So I'm going to show that clip because that's the basis for the rest of what we're going to talk about. It's a short clip. It's only a few minutes long. Then we'll come back and we'll go through what Dr. Bergman had to say about this after the debate. So check out the clip.
Question for Dan. What is the best experiment you can point to for the most substantial macroevolution? Not just homology and comparisons, but actual experiments. Thanks. Thank you.
Oh, man, I love this question. There's so many good ones. So one of my favorite ones is the evolution of de novo multicellularity in a species of green algae that has no multicellularity in its evolutionary history. And over the course of about 2 years in the lab, they evolved into an obligatory multicellular state where they had no unicellular stages in their life cycle. So that was the de novo evolution of multicellularity. And it wasn't just that individual cells accumulate in a colony. It was that a single cell, they divide and they stick together and they form a multicellular structure just like, we do. So that's a really good one. I also love the experiment where, no, it's not just a colony for the chat. I also love the experiment where they, by changing no new genes, no new information, but just a change in the expression pattern of two regulatory genes in crocodiles, allowed the crocodiles to grow feathers. So instead of developing scales on their skin, they develop feathers, which is a new morphological trait. Donnie, I forgot to hit my timer on this one, just FYI. So that's a brand new morphological trait that's only seen in the avian reptiles, but we were able to cause crocodiles to grow feathers as well based on some very minor changes. And then it's not an experiment, but it is a direct observation in nature. We have lizard populations that are right now in progress, converting from laying eggs to giving live birth. That's macroevolution by anyone's standards, I would hope. And just throw one more in there, the endosymbiosis that we've seen. We've got an amoeboid rhizarian becoming a brand new, never before seen type of green algae. I would think that is macroevolution by any reasonable standard. Again, this is an event that's happening in nature, not an experiment, but we are directly observing it.
I don't know how you did that. That was 2 minutes on the dot. I guess you're just used to taking 2 minutes to answer these questions. So to help, in terms of Jerry, you get a 2 minute response. And so Dan, what I noted there, de novo multicellularity in algae species. You pointed out it's not a colony. An expression pattern in crocodiles, allowing the crocodiles to grow feathers rather than scales. That's an interesting one. Lizard populations converting from laying eggs to giving live birth, and also endosymbiosis. So I appreciate those examples in your 2 minutes. Very helpful in terms of engaging in this debate. Jerry, let's give you 2 minutes.
I'm not aware of these examples. Maybe you'll send me information. I could look into them. But the ones I looked into of the so-called feathers on dinosaurs are problematic. And so I have a feeling that the so-called feathers on crocodiles are problematic. But that certainly would be an interesting one to look into. And I'm sure creationists will love to deal with this. So if you let us know information on that, and I'm sure that creationists will love to get into this because they love to look at these examples and see whether or not indeed the the literature does indeed support the claims. So please send me information.
Was the example, Dan, that you pointed to with the crocodiles? Because Jerry, I noticed you mentioned dinosaurs to birds, but was the example you put forth, Dan, did that have to do with something that was tweaked in the lab to make that happen? Oh, Dan, I think you're on mute.
Yeah, this paper is called Multiple Regulatory Modules Are Required for Scale to Feather Conversion, Molecular Biology and Evolution, 2017. I'm going to drop a link in the chat here. Or not a link, but just a reference. I put the link in the chat, in the private chat on StreamYard here. The link is the multicellularity algae paper, and then the reference below that is the crocodile scale feather thing.
Okay. I'll put those in the description box. And Jerry, we can also send you that. Dr. Dan, you might want to send your paper that you wrote with Dr. Hancock as well.
Yeah, we'll do.
As that's directly related to a few things discussed during tonight's debate, and Dr. Bergman might want to interact with that at some point in the future. And so, okay, well, technically, Dan, you get the last word. So if you wanted to say anything quickly before we move on, go ahead.
Just let me think of let's think of some. Lizards with placentas is another example I can think of. Again, not lab, but directly observed. And the reason this matters is because, again, if creationists want to say they were created with the placentas, then we're doing species level creation, which I can't think of any creationists that are down with species level creation. So the lizards with placentas is another really good example of directly observed macroevolution. And because it's a specific species within a kind, we should agree that that's a thing that's new since the flood. After this debate, Dr. Bergman actually released 3 articles about topics that came up during the debate that I guess he didn't feel like he addressed adequately in the moment. I'm only going to talk about the first one of those here, and I will have additional videos looking at the other 2 down the road. So the article we're going to be talking about today was called Lizards Evolving Placentas, the debate between Dr. Jerry Bergman versus Dr. Dan Stern-Cardinal, Common Design or Common Descent. We're going to go through this whole article, and we're going to show 2 things. One, we're going to show that Dr. Bergman is wrong in his assertion that lizards have not evolved placentas. That's kind of the surface level thing we're going to do here. But the bigger, more important thing we're going to do is we're going to show that young Earth creationists have no choice but to accept that this trait, placentas, this complex trait, you might even call it irreducibly complex, evolved in lizards, because the alternatives are self-defeating. So we're going to go through this entire article. It's very short, and you're going to see how this shakes out. The article starts, in the debate, Dr. Dan Stern-Cardinal stated in support of evolution that, quote, an example of a direct observation in nature is lizard populations that are in the process of evolving from the ability of laying eggs to being able to give birth to their offspring, which is macroevolution by anyone's standards. This bold claim was also made in the National Geographic as follows. Evolutionary records show that nearly 100 reptile lineages have independently made the transition from egg-laying to live birth in the past, and today about 20% of all living snakes and lizards give birth to live young only. I was unable to find any evolutionary records that showed 100 reptile lineages have independently made the transition from egg-laying to live birth. What I found was a great deal of variety in reproduction. Some fish and reptiles use a mix of both birthing styles. The mother forms the eggs but retains them inside her body until the end stages of their embryonic development. At this time, the eggshells, due to the calcium absorbed from them, the shell is an important nutrient source, are so thin that embryos can breathe oxygen through them. When they are born, they are covered with only the thin, membrane remnant of their shell. Now, obviously, I want to kind of focus on this part in yellow right here, because I actually have the answer to this in terms of where these evolutionary records are. So let's take a look. Here is the evidence that Dr. Bergman is looking for. This is a 2014 review called Evolution of Vertebrate Viviparity and Specializations for Fetal Nutrition, a quantitative and qualitative analysis. And here is what this author had to say in the abstract of this review. Phylogenetic analyses indicate that viviparity, live-bearing reproduction, has originated independently in more than 150 vertebrate lineages, including a minimum of 115 clades of extant squamate reptiles. Jumping down a little bit, substantial matrotrophy, maternal provision of nutrients to embryos during pregnancy, has arisen at least 33 times in these viviparous clades, with most, 26 of these origins, having occurred among fishes and amphibians. Now, if we look at those numbers, 26 and 33, to those 26, we can add 1 for mammals, that gets you to 27, which leaves 6 instances that occurred in reptiles. Now, of course, Dr. Bergman thinks this didn't happen, but that's contradictory with mainstream young Earth models. I don't know Dr. Bergman's position specifically on the question of how many created kinds there are, so it's possible he favors something approximating species-level creation, in which case he would be able to reject the common ancestry of placental and oviparous reptiles. Right? I don't actually specifically know Dr. Bergman's position on that, but I think he holds a more conventional position that approximates the family level of kinds. And if you approximate kind with family, then you have to agree that those viviparous lineages, and specifically the ones that provide nutrition to the embryos, not just have the eggs develop internally, and that would include the ones that have developed placentas, those must be descended from oviparous common ancestors that they share with their close relatives in the same kind that continue to lay eggs. In his article, Dr. Bergman continues, the other approach is that some lizards called skinks can conserve their body's nutrient resources by depositing eggs outside of their body for their final days of early development. In harsh mountain climates, skinks protect their young by keeping them inside their bodies until they are ready to survive the outside world. Rather than providing evidence for evolution, this example illustrates a level of design that allows the animal to adapt to a variety of environments. Handwork correctly observes that the move from egg-laying to live birth in reptiles is fairly common because it's relatively easy to make the switch. The reason it is easy to make the switch is because the egg system is very complex. So complex that the live birth method is only one more level of complexity on the 12 basic steps required for egg production-reproduction method. The wide variety of animal birthing styles was described by Doyle as follows, and we'll see that quote in the next section. But before we get to it, I want to comment on the highlighted section here, because that's not an accurate description of the species I was referring to in the debate. The lizards that I'm talking about as the best examples of macroevolution develop true placentas. And for the evidence of this, we can look at this 2012 paper, Invasive Implantation and Intimate Placental Associations in a Placentatrophic African Lizard. I'm not going to try to pronounce the scientific name of this lizard. This is figure 7 from this paper, and it shows directly the structures involved in the transfer of nutrients from the pregnant lizard to the developing embryo. That part labeled in that figure in the lower left part and the lower right part, panels C and D, the part labeled CVP, that's the placenta. That's it right there. This is considerably more complex than keeping the young inside their bodies until they are ready to survive in the outside world. What I believe Dr. Bergman is describing is the much more common form of reproduction where the eggs are maintained internally and essentially either dissolve or hatch internally before the live young are released. That's not what's going on here. This is a true placenta, and you can actually see the structure in this figure from the paper. So let's go back to the article itself. We're going to start with this block quote here. Lizards reproduce in an amazing variety of ways. Some lay eggs, oviparity, and some bear live young, viviparity. Most species rely mostly on egg yolk for nutrition during embryonic development. A few have next to no yolk and rely completely on a placental connection to the mother. Some lizard placentas even compare with the complexity of mammalian placentas. Some species can vary the timing of birth. There are a rare few species that even have a variety in their reproductive mode. This variety, when lined up by evolutionists, produces, quote, populations that are in different stages of this process, which you can begin to put together what looks like the transition from one birth style to another, end quote. Furthermore, by doing so, one could attempt to prove evolution from eggs to live birth, or from live birth viviparity to the egg design oviparity birth, or from live birth to the ability to, depending on conditions, employ either live birth or the egg approach as used by 3 known lizard species. These 3 known lizard species have the built-in design to use either oviparity or viviparity. No evidence exists that they have evolved or are evolving from oviparity to viviparity. Now, first, I just want to point out with that last bit, in the conventional young Earth model, where created kinds approximize the family level in the kind of Linnaean hierarchy, right, from kingdom down to species, in that model, there has to be evolution in one direction or the other here. Either they started with placentas and then some lost them, or they started without placentas and some gained them. There has to be some evolutionary transition happening here unless you are invoking species level creation, which almost no young Earth creationists accept. But that's secondary to the main thing I want to point out here, which is the highlighted part, because this is really something. I'm really surprised Dr. Bergman describes the work of evolutionists like this. We don't line up living species and say this evolved into this, which evolved into that, right? That's the same fallacy as like chimps evolved into humans, right? It's the same concept, right? We don't line up living things. No living things are descended from other living things. We share common ancestors in the past. So this representation of how evolutionists have reconstructed this evolutionary history is either a fundamental misunderstanding or a gross misrepresentation of evolutionary processes and our understanding of evolutionary processes. To be crystal clear, no extant species evolved into any other extant species. They share common ancestors in the past. So we don't just line up things that are alive today and say, aha, that's the evolutionary progression. It's not how it works. And I'm shocked that a professional young Earth creationist would represent the process like that. It's very surprising. So let's look at the end of this article. Like I said, it's a short article. Let's get back to it. It is possible that some lizard types had the capacity for both reproductive modes, but lost one or the other type in history. Evolutionists don't generally consider this possibility because it is a process of information loss, which does not support microbes to microbiologists' upward trending model of evolution. Summary. The variety of reproduction design proves not evolution, but rather the intelligent design worldview. The existence of viviparity and oviparity in one type of animal actually creates problems for evolution, such as the problem of 2 different systems simultaneously evolving in the same animal. When one function there appears, in most cases at least, no reason for natural selection for the other competing reproductive system. Lastly, there was no evidence in the research reviewed above of lizards evolving placentas, but rather much evidence of not only intelligent design, but also over-design. Okay, so that's how he wraps it up. It's all design and creation rather than evolution. So let's see if that holds up just in terms of what the options are and which are consistent with creationism and tolerable within creationist models. Let's go through our options. Okay, our first option to explain the observations that some lizards have placentas is that lizards evolved placentas. Now, obviously, this is rejected by young Earth creationists. That's too much evolution. If you open the door to lizards evolving placentas, then forget about it. We're basically acknowledging any level of macroevolution can occur. So that's not something that young Earth creationists can live with. So let's look at the second option. Some lizards were created with placentas. This is a problem for young Earth creationists because it requires species-level creation. And that's rejected by virtually all young Earth creationists and is rejected by all of the major young Earth creationist ministries and organizations, right? Answers in Genesis, Creation Ministries International, Institute for Creation Research. None of them hold a position of species level of creation. They all kind of approximate the family level creation model. And the reason for this is obvious. If you accept species level creation, you have to fit like hundreds of thousands of animals on the ark. It's a complete non-starter, right? Just logistically, it doesn't work. And you'll also find reasons from these creationist organizations that species level creation is actually inconsistent with Genesis. So that option, that's out for virtually all young Earth creationists. We can't accept that you have all of these different lineages of reptiles created. Some of them specifically were created with placentas. We reject that option. However, there is a third option that sounds like the best option at first. And that option is the front loading of the genetic information for both egg laying and placental development, followed by the loss of one or the other in each species. Now that sounds really good at first. That sounds like an option until you dig in a little bit, and it turns out it's actually the worst option of the three for young Earth creationists. The reason this is a problem is that the loss of that information would have to have occurred with no trace in any of the lineages that no longer have the ability to make placentas. No pseudogenes, no remnants, no evidence of the deletions. Perfectly clean removal across all but a few species of lizards. And yes, it would have to have been in individual species, because the deletions would have to have occurred after the species that make placentas diverge from the ones that don't. So we have to have individual species having the same mutations and deletions occurring perfectly, cleanly, identically across hundreds of lineages of reptiles. So either you're going to appeal to a tremendously improbable series of events that left no genetic trace, or even worse, you could propose ongoing divine intervention in one of two directions. You either add or remove the required genetic components in a lineage-specific or species-specific manner. And of course, that kind of divine intervention isn't testable. So we can dismiss that option out of hand as far as our quest for a scientific explanation goes. And young Earth creationists don't like to add in to their models, additional miracles, because I think they correctly recognize that once you start explicitly adding miracles to the process, you're no longer in the realm of science, and the goal is to, at least on the surface, appear like this is a scientific idea. So that third option, that's the worst option of all, because that completely gives up the game. So that's where we're going to leave this, everyone. There are no good options for young Earth creationists regarding lizards with placentas. You can admit that they evolved, but young Earth creationists don't want to permit that level of evolution in their models. That opens the door to way too much evolution, so we reject that option. But then, if you don't allow for placentas to evolve, you have to invoke one of two ideas that you otherwise explicitly reject, either species-level creation or divine intervention. And both of those are complete non-starters for mainstream young Earth creation models. Maybe they need to change their models to accommodate one of these two ideas, but that's going to be a really tough sell. But what other options do you have? Either they evolved, or you go down some really untenable pathways to species-level creation or divine intervention. Basically, heads, I win, tails, you lose. Thanks for playing, young Earth creationists. So that's the story of lizards evolving placentas, how we know, and why it is a serious problem for young Earth creationists. Thank you for watching. Please remember to subscribe to the channel if you are not already subscribed. Hit the thumbs up button, or if you don't like this, I don't care, hit the thumbs down button. That's fine too. It's all the same to me. Leave a comment, share the video, and if you want to get access to pre-recorded videos like this when I upload them, instead of having to wait for the public release, you could consider becoming a channel member. Members at any level get immediate access to the pre-recorded videos. Thank you again for watching, and don't get fooled.